Last year, we had more immigration than in the entire decades of the 80s and 90s combined. You need to understand that Britain is a post-revolutionary society. The revolution has already happened. We've been ideologically subverted. We've had a quadrupling of in this country in the last 10 years. No society, no culture can sustain such rapid demographic change. We've had data from Denmark and Sweden for quite a while now, and we know exactly which countries are causing all of these issues. So,
part of the rhetoric around immigration, it's payback, it's revenge.
The empire strikes back. 81% of British Muslims identify. We're at great risk of having a state within a state or multiple states.
Yeah, this is the balkanization of Britain.
There's a very muscular promotion of French identity in France, which I think is why you're seeing this backlash.
Strong man, the case against British colonialism. And
An important point to remember here.
Is there a British identity that can unite all of these people?
Well, if you want to understand why the world's gone crazy and why everything seems to have been completely made topsy-turvy, you need to understand that.
Before you hear from Rafe Heydel-Mankoo, I ask if you want to support this show. All you have to do is press subscribe. You do that, I can have more phenomenal guests like Rafe exploring the issues you want to hear about that the mainstream media won't touch. And if you head over to winstonmarshall.co.uk, you will get exclusive videos, content, and ad-free viewing. But without further ado, Rafe Heydel-Mankoo. Rafe Heydel-Mankoo, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk with me. I've been watching you taking on the libs of GB News and Talk TV and the mainstream media, as well as these very viral videos defending the British Empire, colonialism, the Commonwealth. And I wanted to talk to you today to get into the British Empire and Commonwealth, particularly as it seems to be something that doesn't go away from our imagination. And just if I can give some more context to this conversation. So, of course, 5 years ago around BLM, a lot of conversation around reparations and what the British did, the slavery and the horrors of slavery and what might be done about that today, as well as a continued narrative, I think, from aspects of British society that colonialism or British Empire specifically was a unique evil of looting, famine, massacre, slaughter, pillage and plunder. I think it's also the case that, I'll note that you've been in an ex sort of challenge with Stormzy, the rapper and singer, over this and offering to debate him on the issue after he said that the British Empire is the darkest shit ever. And you riposted saying, nothing has done more to advance the world and lift it out of poverty than colonialism and capitalism. But as well as that, last month, our king and the sovereign head of state of Canada, did a land acknowledgement saying that the land was unceded territory. The Chagos deal has just been put through. It's been dubbed the last colony, and though it's not technically reparations, although we have paid reparations to the Chagosians, it is being... it seems like it's de facto reparations. I'd like to explore that with you and how that came about. And it's also the case that President Trump joked, I think, about America joining the Commonwealth again. And I'm very interested also in exploring the Commonwealth, legacy of the Commonwealth in how it might have affected the mass immigration and affecting the culture today in Britain. So those are some of the things I was hoping to explore with you. Perhaps we could start with the what happened in Canada, because am I right? You're one of your fields of expertise is Canada.
Yes, I went to university in Canada. I lived there for my teenage years and some of my 20s. So a great deal of knowledge there. And I was I'm a trustee of the Canadian Royal Heritage Trust and was a chairman of the Monarchist League of Canada as well. So deep knowledge of the Canadian monarchy in particular.
Okay, so the king says that he did this land acknowledgement, which is already a very woke thing to do, and he said that it was unceded territory, which seems to me that he's suggesting that it's not his sovereign land, and it's not a real state. And a funny coincidence is that 2 months ago, whatever it was, President Trump was saying he wants to make Canada the 51st state. Well, if the king, the head of state in Canada, is saying it's unceded territory, does that mean that it's legitimate for Trump to claim it the 51st state? And I'd also note that the left-wing commentariat we're saying, how dare Trump call it the 51st state? It's undermined. It's challenging his neighbor this way. But our own king has done that.
Yes, well, I mean, it's historically ignorant and to claim that the Canadian lands don't belong to His Majesty the King. That the crown it's the crown in right of Canada is the legal term for the monarchy, and they do hold all the lands. The relationship between the First Nations peoples in Canada is very different to in America. In America, there really was a genocide against the native populations there, great oppression, massacres of them all. The relationship in Canada was very different, and essentially the Canadian crown entered into treaties with the First Nations peoples, and it's for that reason that the chiefs of the Indian tribes have always been very fiercely loyal to the crown, and would in fact petition to, say, Queen Victoria when they perceived themselves to have been wronged by her Canadian government. They would then write to the Queen, who they regarded as the great mother chief of all of them, and of course, because monarchy is in essence a very fundamental concept of governance historically, and so they understood the concept of monarchy far easier. It worked in their tribal system to have a chief, and they understood it in the monarchical tradition. And so you do have these land treaties where territory was ceded over from the tribes to the crown, and of course in 1763 that was one of the reasons that you had the native tribes allying with the British monarchy and Britain against the American states, because of course they had these treaties and they were going to be given certain rights and privileges.
This is the French and Indian Wars, right?
Yeah, from the French and Indian. But then, of course, when it came into the all of the acts of the Quebec Act and so forth, when you had all of these hostile acts as far as the American colonists were seen, we had the start of the war, and the native peoples were on the side of the crown in all of that, because they had a respect and a treaties there. And of course today the Mohawks, for example, remain deeply attached to the crown. People may be familiar in this country.
Are the Mohawks in Canada?
The Mohawks are in Canada. So people may be familiar, for example, with chapel royals, the chapels royal in this country, which are places like St. George's Chapel, Windsor, for example. And these are special churches of the monarch, who has a particular connection to them. There are only 3 other chapels royal outside of Britain, and they're all in Canada, and they're all Mohawk chapels. So these are chapels on Mohawk territory, and the Queen has visited, the late Queen visited them, gave them silverware and so forth. So there's a deep and abiding connection there, much as you have also in New Zealand with the Maoris and the Treaty of Waitangi. Again, there you compare the Maori to, say, the Aborigines in Australia, and there again there's a treaty between the Maori and the crown, and that's why, of course, you also have in the Maori tradition a great deal of respect for the monarchy. So this land acknowledgement, which is an American concept, it really doesn't belong in Canada, and but of course the king is obliged to read the words that are given to him, because although it is the king's speech from the throne, of course we know that it's written by the Prime Minister and by the government.
So you say it was Mohawk territory. So it's not necessarily unceded territory, right? Because it would be different parts of Canada would have been.
They may even. I mean, the Mohawks weren't in Ottawa, but you had the Algonquin, and you had Iroquois, and so there's a whole bunch of different groups around all of that. But certainly, it's established now, of course, that the crown has duties as well. So the crown protects the native populations, and you have reservations. They have casinos on their territory as well that they're allowed to run and operate. They have ancient hunting rights and so forth as well. But there's been a very good and warm relationship. In fact, on the Canadian Royal Heritage Trust, in which I serve, we also have I think a Mohawk Chief Marshal who's a member of our board of trustees as well.
Okay, so there are good relations, right? I wonder if we might zoom out a little bit and do a bit of history, if you don't mind, and mainly because I have lots of black holes and which I want filled. But I guess I wanted to discuss with you Commonwealth, and that's something that's doesn't get talked a lot. It talks a lot about British colonialism, but it's hard to talk about Commonwealth without the context of colonialism. Am I right in saying that? Now, a quick interruption from our sponsor, Ground News. We specifically partnered with Ground News because their app and website help me and my team cut through media bias and get the full picture on any news story. Let's take a look at an example. This is how the media is covering how Elon Musk is floating the idea of a third party amid his feud with Donald Trump. Left-leaning The American Prospect ran the headline, "The Elon-Trump feud is oligarchy in action." Now let's turn to Ground News to see how the rest of the media is covering this story. There are multiple articles published on Musk, and we can access every single one through Ground News, complete with source, context, and a breakdown of key information. Meanwhile, right-leaning post-millennial ran the headline, Elon Musk floats new political party in US to represent 80% in the middle, which is a very different narrative from the American prospect. Seeing all sides, regardless of political lean, is essential in making informed decisions and spotting media bias. That's why Ground News' blind spot feed, which highlights stories underreported by either side, is such a powerful tool. I genuinely believe in what Ground News is doing, and I encourage you to check it out by scanning the QR code or by visiting ground.news/Winston. If you subscribe through my link, you'll get 40% off unlimited access. Ground News is subscriber funded, and by supporting my sponsors, you supporting this show. But back to the interview.
Yes, because the Commonwealth developed out of the empire directly.
In 1931. Right. Would you say it's the beginning of the Commonwealth?
Well, yeah. I mean, the term Commonwealth dates back to the 19th century, but what eventually happened, of course, was originally the dominions of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand began to get autonomy. So in 1926, at the Imperial Conference, it was decided that all the dominions would have equal status with the UK, so they wouldn't be in sort of a master-subject relationship as had been the case before, that Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and so forth would have a equal status with the UK. And then in 1931, you had the Statute of Westminster, which essentially said that the British government could no longer legislate for issues affecting those countries specifically, unless without the consent. But those were the dominions. But then you still had the colonies in Africa, India as well. Didn't become a dominion until independence, 1947, in Pakistan and in India. So you have a two-tier. You have the dominions, which essentially, the white nations, and then you had the colonies. And after the Second World War, that's when you get the development of the Commonwealth as a concept.
And this is also when you have there's the British nationality. One of the other things that's going to tie all this together also is the concept of identity and British identity and Commonwealth identity. But we have the immigration. There's the British Nationality Act in 1948, which is significant to do with the immigration coming into Britain. But then you have the Commonwealth Immigration Act, right? So already there's a tiering that they want to include India. Have I understood that correctly?
So what happened was, you see, originally there was no distinction between member states of the British Empire. So there was no separate citizenship or nationality. There was no such thing as an Australian citizen or a Canadian or a British citizen in that concept. We were all subjects. We were all subjects of the Crown. And whether you were in Christchurch, New Zealand, or Cape Town, South Africa, or Winnipeg, Manitoba, or Glasgow, you were all equally British under the Crown. There was no distinction there whatsoever. And of course, that also meant you had the right of abode in this country too, because these concepts predated by a long way mass transport and aeroplane travel and so forth. This was one of Enoch Powell's great concerns. He said, we do have this very noble concept that everybody in the empire is equally a subject of the Crown, but that's going to cause problems once you have mass transport routes and ships able to bring people over here. 1947 in Canada, they passed the first Citizenship Act of Canada, and that broke this concept of the indivisibility of being British and created its first unique citizenship. And so following that, other countries fell into place, and that's why you had the UK then creating its own Citizenship Act. But uniquely, Britain decided to retain some links to the Commonwealth in ways that haven't been reciprocated. So along with the Caribbean, in Britain, of course, if you're a Commonwealth citizen, you can vote in elections. Now, that wasn't such a big issue when there weren't that many Commonwealth citizens here. But of course, now that we have such vast numbers living in this country, even people just here on a 6-month visa from India can vote in our general elections. And if you have, say, 1 million or 2 million Indians here on a visa, being able to potentially turn the tide of an election despite having no buy-in into our country, these things are challenges. I'm a great traditionalist, but I think some things like this do need to be addressed and changed. But of course, we still take, British Army still recruits from the Commonwealth. Commonwealth citizens have every right to fight in the British Army, just as much as, which you don't find elsewhere, where you need to be a citizen of that country, can also stand for election. I mean, there's been Bonar Law was a Canadian who became Prime Minister of this country. So those are the historical anomalies of the Commonwealth. Of course, traditionally, when you had Commonwealth immigration, say with Windrush in the 1950s and so forth, there was still a degree of cultural compatibility because these people from the Commonwealth were raised in an English-style education system. They learnt the English language. There was a portrait of Queen Elizabeth on the wall. They sang God Save the Queen.
Yeah.
And they really did regard Britain as the mother country, and they learned English history and British history. So, of course, that's why we don't call them foreigners. We have the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. And the distinction there is if you're an American or a Frenchman, you're foreign, but if you're Commonwealth, you're not really foreign. What we've done now with the mass immigration that we've seen in the recent years is you've got people coming from Afghanistan, Eritrea, Somalia, places that have absolutely no connection to the crown. So not only is there the cultural issues that you would have with non-Western immigration, but suddenly these people don't speak the language, but they also have no comprehension of British history or culture at all, which is a big break from the Commonwealth immigration.
So that's absolutely the case. And I reading recently about Jamaica, and Sir Trevor Phillips wrote a great book about the Windrush generation. And they actually did see themselves as British in the sense that Britain was the part of their identity. And particularly after the Second World War, where they made a huge contribution. But what's curious is that there are countries that are part of the Commonwealth that are not integrating so well in Britain, and Pakistan would be an obvious example. But I think, generally speaking, it seems to be not always, but Muslim countries coming to Britain. But so, how does that fit with your argument exactly? Because if the Commonwealth was so successful in creating a unifying culture and identity, then why is it that not all of these former...
That's not my argument. I'm just saying it was better than what we have now. I'm not saying by any stretch that it was ideal to have vast numbers of Commonwealth people coming here either. My point simply was, the one good thing about that type of immigration was they spoke the same language, they had the common law system, they had the same parliamentary system, many of them were monarchies, they understood British history. That's all I'm saying. And in the small numbers in which they came in the 50s and 60s, you had a great deal of integration there. So if you look, for example, I grew up in the 80s and I remember watching the Olympics, and you would have, people maybe too young now to remember these characters, but Daley Thompson, Tessa Sanderson, Linford Christie, we had comedians like Kenny Lynch and so forth. Now nobody saw them as being black, really. They were British. We didn't perceive them as being any different. They had English accents, Cockney accents. That's because they were part of the Commonwealth, and they were Anglican, probably Anglican church goers as well. Their parents were certainly. So they were brought up in the culture of Britain, even if they came from elsewhere or their parents came from elsewhere. They were very easily to assimilate. As the children of immigrants, they assimilated very easily. That's not something we encounter now because of the numbers who are coming over here, but also they're coming from cultures and traditions that aren't steeped in the structures of Britain that were left, of course, say in the Caribbean.
I'm not totally convinced by that, and the reason being that I think if you look, and this is again reading Sir Trevor Phillips' book, but when, let's say, the Jamaicans were in Britain during the war, they were absolutely included and part of the British identity. But when you see after the war increased tensions, there was a separation in identity when it seemed more like the indigenous English in opposition to the West Indians and Caribbeans. And so there was a change and that's why you have the Notting Hill riots, Nottingham riots, and increased tension.
I'm not denying any of that. So I don't think we aren't at cross purposes here. I'm just saying there was more successful integration there than we're seeing now. That's my only point, because there were more commonalities in those days and there were fewer of them. Today there are fewer commonalities and more people coming from in numbers. That's why we're having much more of a crisis with integration.
I certainly agree with the second one. Mass migration at the scale it is today, and I think the latest figures has it, even though it's half what it was last year, it's still at 500,000. Roughly 500,000 net migrants into the country.
But also, it's important, never use the net migration figures. So net migration is something we must stop using, because net migration figures look at the gross number coming, and then they subtract those people who've left the country. Mm-hmm. So if a million come in, but 500,000 have left, that means you've got a net number of 500,000. But the people who are leaving and the people who are arriving are vastly different. And all that net migration looks at is the pressures on infrastructure and on the economy. But it's the cultural change that happens, because those leaving, a large number of the people leaving this country, it's white flight, people going to Canada, Australia, retiring to Spain, going to Australia. It's bright Europeans who are going elsewhere, who don't want to stay in this country any longer. A lot of them are high-skilled people, part of the brain drain, whereas those who are coming in, the overwhelming majority, are low-skilled immigrants, many of them coming from culturally incompatible parts of the country. So it may seem that there's only 700,000 coming in, but the reality is it's 1.2 million who've come in, and that's a huge number. I think it's the 15 Birminghams need to be built by the time you get to 2050. But it's the radical change people can see in their communities, on the town level, in their cities. Their communities have fundamentally changed, and that's because of the gross number of people coming from completely different cultures, who are living essentially segregated lives, whose their daily days pass without any interaction with wider society. And of course, that's why suddenly you're getting all of these antisocial behavior and the cultural tensions that you see on the streets of the days. And just remember, last year we had more immigration than in the entire decades of the 80s and 90s combined. 20 years worth of immigration just last year. We had more immigration in the last 25 years than in the last 2,000 years combined. So no society, no culture can sustain such rapid demographic change, particularly when you think about it in the gross number terms.
Yeah, quite. And also, if you look at, and there was a lot of immigration after the war, by the way, and we don't need to talk about that, but we're talking in the hundreds of thousands directly after the war, before it came down in the 80s. I think Thatcher, we actually got into negative net migration.
In the 80s, we had negative net immigration. If you look at the 80s and 90s, 50,000 was the average number of immigrants who were coming into this country. 50,000 is now the number of people coming over every year on the cross-channel boat dinghies. So our illegal immigration cross-channel is actually the same size as our legal immigration we had in the 80s and 90s. And what amazes me is that even people on the right, so for example in the Tory party, you've got a fairly sensible grouping there. I forget the New Conservatives, Danny Kruger, Miriam Cates and others part of it. And they were talking about getting immigration down to 250,000, as if that's somehow an acceptable figure. And I thought, even you on the right of the Tory party don't understand. We should be talking about, perhaps a moratorium on all immigration for a few years, but certainly down to the tens of thousands, if not just a few thousand.
Yeah, quite. And regardless about the cultural aspect, when you have immigration at such a level, even if these people wanted to integrate, they're with so many people, it's not entirely clear how they could, because they'd be surrounded by essentially whole communities of people moving at once.
Well, that's just it. Well, look, it's human nature to stick to your own kind, right? So it's not racist to say these people won't integrate. If you go to Spain, there are entire enclaves of English communities there who don't integrate, right? I've got friends in Dubai. They've been there 15, 16 years. They don't know anybody who's not English, let alone not knowing any Arabs. They don't know any French or Americans either. It's human instinct. My great uncle and aunt came over here in 1940. They were part of the Polish government. He was ADC to the Polish president. Now, his grandmother was English, and she was the cousin of the Duke of Devonshire, and he spoke English, and he would go to Ascot Hen, he would do all the English things, picture of the Queen in his living room, but he always considered himself Polish. Even after 60 years of living in the country, we would be watching a TV documentary or a comedy. He'd say, "Oh, don't the British make good comedies?" This is after 60 years. And I thought, this is somebody who's European, Christian, related, speaks the language fluently. Even he doesn't feel identified. He's proud to live in the country. But if someone like that even can't integrate, what hope is there for people coming from radically different cultures? And of course, there's no incentive to assimilate when you've got your own communities with your own mosques, your own shops, your own community centres. You've got satellite TV.
Your own courts.
Your own Sharia courts. There are parts of the north of England where the Asian school children think Britain is a majority Asian country because they've never encountered anyone else. And there's absolutely no way in which British culture is seeping into these communities, because they don't watch any television or radio or anything like that. So that's, as I say, that's why we're getting to the state now where diversity is our greatest weakness, and it is leading to the disintegration of this country along sectarian lines, and we are sinking increasingly into having ethno-nationalist silos. And the next stage of this, of course, is the election of Muslim MPs through the Muslim vote and so forth. And so we're at great risk of having a state within a state, or multiple states within a state within the United Kingdom. As I say, we'll cease to be a United Kingdom and become a United Nations.
Yeah, this is the balkanization of Britain. If I can make a point of perhaps an attempt to white pill you on this particular topic, but when we had a great interview with Bijan Omrani, who's just done a great book called God is an Englishman, about how England became Christian and essentially the history of Christianity through Britain and how it affected the culture. But when King Alfred brought the people of this island together, firstly, there were 5 different languages, many different religions, pagan gods, and he united everyone around Christianity, around one language, around a history. He translated a bunch of books, and he created a legal system. And it seems that we're on the way of dismantling all of that, with, as you've just described there. But he was able to bring them all together. And so I wondered whether there might be hope to bring everyone together again. And this is, I guess the question would be, is there a British identity that can unite all of these people?
I don't think there is a British identity that can unite certain segments of the current society that we have in this country. You have to remember, I'm talking primarily about Islam here. And polling shows from Policy Exchange that 81% of British Muslims identify as being Muslim first and British second.
I'll push you on that, though, because if you ask a lot of Christians, they'll say they identify as being Christian before they're being British.
No, and the reason I raised this is because if the same number in Germany, it's only 67%. And in France, it's only 46%. So 46% of French Muslims say that they're French first and Muslim second. 67% of German Muslims say that they are Muslim first. Here is 81%. Now, we often think about France as having the greatest issues with integration and so forth. I think one of the reasons you see so many terrorist attacks and so forth in France is because France is actually enforcing a very strong, aggressive sectarianism on society. So it wants to ban, for example, the burqa or enforce wearing of bikinis on the beach. There's a very muscular promotion of French identity in France, which I think is why you're seeing this backlash from extremist elements within Islam. In this country, there's no need for them to do that because we just bend over. We're so accommodating of their culture that they don't need to have these sorts of these forced pushbacks. And it's just very easily demonstrable. We have been promoting for far too long minority cultures over the overarching British culture. And it's got to the point now that without radical policies, I don't see how you need to reduce the number of people here if you're going to have any hope of integration. Because, as I said, it's a very basic...
Reducing the amount of people already here.
Yeah. So you have to have mass deportations of illegal immigrants. Anyone convicted of a crime who's a dual national has to be deported from this country. We need to do what Sweden is now doing, and what the Swiss and the Hungarians and the Finns are considering. And that's voluntary remigration, where you pay in Sweden. The
Americans also.
Yeah. So the Swedes are offering 300,000 krona, which is around £25,000 per person, to go back to where they came from. I would assume to renounce your citizenship, so you can't return. If you're a family of 5, that's an amazing amount of money to go back to the Sudan or Eritrea or Somalia. And now some people at home will be screaming, why should we be paying money? Well, the fact is only 1 in 20 migrants to this country is a high-skilled net contributor, only 5%. The vast majority of people who arrive on this country are a net drain on the economy from the moment they set foot upon British soil. I mean, I think it's only 12% of migrants are skilled workers, but the majority of skilled workers are also low-wage earners. So for every pound that a high-skilled net contributor puts in, low-skilled take out £1.60 from the economy. That means by the time they get to the age of retirement, the majority of low-skilled workers are going to cost the taxpayer on average £151,000 each. If they get to the age of 81, they will have cost us £465,000 each. So an initial outlay of say 20 grand to go out, renounce your citizenship, seems to me to make economic sense. But unless you dramatically lower the population of this country, then I don't see that. And it's in our interest to do so, of course, because we've had a quadrupling of rape in this country in the last 10 years. In Britain's now Britain's. Oh yeah. Well, the fact is, we've had data from Denmark and Sweden for quite a while now, and we know exactly which countries are causing all of these issues. So in Sweden, Algerians in Sweden are 122 times more likely to commit rape. In Germany, Pakistanis and Afghanis are 16 times more likely to commit rape. In France, 70 more than 70%, or I think 77% of rapes in Paris are foreign nationals. 95% or 92% of thefts on public transport in Paris are by foreign nationals. And we know precisely which countries these are. This is North Africa, it's the Middle East, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. So we know what the trouble spots are. If you want to have a healthy, harmonious, peaceful society, you simply need to stop having immigration from those countries. Now, that might be unfair on those qualified people who are coming over who as great contributors, but you get to the point where you have to look at the greater good here. And only 0.8% of our immigrants are doctors. Only 0.6% are scientists and engineers. You know, the vast majority coming here aren't contributing in the ways that we would think we would want people to contribute. So you need to tackle all of that, and before you can have any hope of creating a blueprint for integration.
So I just want to, I don't think this necessarily contradicts the point I was trying to make, which is that Christians in England will identify as Christian, but not necessarily all of them, but a lot of them would, if they are believers, will identify primarily as Christian before they're British. And so if it's a problem that Muslims do that, then implied, I think, is that Islam is the problem underneath.
Well, my point is essentially that this is not all Muslims, right? There are many, many Muslims who are well adjusted and integrated into British society, but people often say, oh, it's a tiny minority of Muslims who behave like this or believe this and believe that. It's a very sizable minority. And my point is, you can't have an integrated society if you have an alternative competing ideology. And Islam is as much a political force as it is an ideological force. It's also a way of life, right? For a large percentage of the Muslim population. And those beliefs and attitudes run contrary to our beliefs and attitudes. So for free speech, for example, 62% of Muslims believe that you should suppress free speech in the interest of not causing offense to religion. A majority believe it should be illegal to show a portrait or a picture of Muhammad, for example. 52% think it should be illegal to be homosexual.
This is the Henry Jackson Society.
No, it's not just Henry Jackson. There's populist polling, Channel 4 polling. There's a lot of stuff on this. 52% believe it should be legal to be homosexual. It's only 5% in the broader population. But it's when you look at the youth of this country, of the Muslim youth, who are more radicalized than their parents and grandparents. So, 1/3 of British youth, Muslim youth in this country, 16 to 24, believe you should be put to death for apostasy. So you need to understand that these beliefs and attitudes, again, it's not the entire population. It's only 1/3, but these are large numbers of people we're talking about. 10%, 9% of British Muslims identify or admit openly to being jihadis who support terrorism. Now that's 400,000 people. One in 10 of the population. 40,000 Muslims on the jihadi watch list. That's 1 in 100 Muslims.
And if it's just men, it'd be 1 in 50.
So once you realize those sorts of numbers and those dynamics, that needs to be addressed, and that the integration of those communities is not possible. But that's not to say that the integration of other Muslims isn't impossible. Of course it is, and we see it every day.
Your concerns then primarily with the Muslims who are here, or do you have similar concerns with other groups?
No, well, there are other groups you could apply it to too. I mean, well, you just, for example, London is now the Metropolitan Police now has a department training police on how to detect witchcraft ritual abuse linked to African child abuse rituals, and also from South America and from Africa, you have people doing terrible things in this country to children as part of they believe that they're possessed or whatever. That's going on here. Of course, you've got a lot of troubles coming from people from Central Africa, for example. We see here with people in churches and so forth, making people take potions, and there's a whole lot of cultural issues. And London used to be, of course, the most welcoming place in the country if you were homosexual. Now it's the most homophobic part of the whole country.
Is it actually?
Yeah, London is the most homophobic, and that's not just because of Muslims; it's because of evangelical Christians and others from Africa. So my point is, we're talking about a society that took centuries to evolve to where it got to in the early 2000s. And if you believe in liberal, there's not even a conservative perspective. If you believe in liberal values, if you believe in women's rights, if you believe in gay rights, if you believe in Jews being able to walk the streets openly, you should be very worried about the introduction of people from very illiberal states and who have very illiberal attitudes and beliefs that run contrary to what we believed for a long time had been firmly settled and established here.
Well, it seems to be that one of the problems we're having is that we can't actually identify what it is to be British, like explicitly. And I kind of already made this point in this conversation, or already tried to ask that question, but you'll have followed over the last few months, there's been a conversation online and through other alternative media and on mainstream media about what does it mean to be English? Is Rishi Sunak an Englishman? What does it mean to be British? And why I ask the question is there something in the identity in British that can unify all of these people? And why I ask about Alfred is because it seems to me that if those who are English and British themselves can't make a case for what it is that is the unifying aspect, and it can't be ethno-nationalism, that it's going to, and by ethno-nationalism I mean the race aspect, the racial blood aspect. What is the common heritage? What is it to be English and British? I guess maybe that's the simple question. What is it to you to be English and British?
Well, I would never say that I'm English simply because I do regard English as being a racial identity myself personally. I think the only way I would be English is if England separated from the UK and you had a separate English citizenship, and you held an English, then I would be a passport holder of an English passport. Now I have Saxon. My mother's from Saxony rather than from Anglo-Saxon country, so I have some sort of emotional tie to this country, and I have English ancestors going back several hundred years, but not in recent times. So
may I push on that? Then was Benjamin Disraeli English?
He was British. There's a distinction.
But he would have called him. He called himself British, and he also called himself English.
So we got to remember the British identity was a construct of the 18th century. Britishness was invented after the Act of Union between Scotland and England to try to unite
1707.
To try to unite two fiercely independent people. And of course, that notion of Britishness then was for Ireland, and so tradition, and then of course everybody in the empire was British under the law. But for example, if you ask for a long time people of the four nations of the UK whether they identified as British or English or Scots or whatever, the English would always say that they were British, and the Ulstermen of Northern Ireland, for obvious reasons, will say that they're British. But the Scots and the Welsh always identified as being Scottish and Welsh rather than British. Ethnic minorities who immigrated over here were never comfortable saying that they were English because they understood it very simply in the way that I'm saying it.
Just
as well.
As the Jamaicans would
and so
recognize it was an English, Indigenous.
Identified being British rather than being English because it was common sense, And for example, there's a chap I saw in Japan. He was born in Japan. He's English. He was born in Japan. He speaks only Japanese. He learnt English late, and when he speaks English, it's with a very, very comical Japanese accent. And nobody in Japan would say that he's Japanese, right?
Yeah, right. So, but we'll come back to the British aspect, but there are obviously on a much smaller scale. There are cases of peoples coming to England. I think the Normans in 1066, they weren't English. But when we look back at them, they are English.
Well, no, right? They were Norman.
They were Norman.
I wouldn't say the Huguenots were Huguenots. They weren't English.
Right, they weren't English at the time. But at some point, they become English, right? You don't still think of them as separate. The Normans as separate groups today in Britain. They've integrated.
Sure.
So they make up part of the English.
Yes, but I think it's well, we can talk about this in 300 years, maybe. Be a better point to discuss it. I think at this stage, I would say British is the easiest way to define being British, and it's not just. And people say, what does it mean to be British, or what does it mean to be English? Well, look, Billy Bragg and Jacob Rees-Mogg would have very different criteria of what it means to be English and British. I don't think you can naturally go down to these concepts of we have shared values and so forth. We believe in democracy and the rule of law, because those things apply just as equally to the Swedes and the Danes as they do to us. Those aren't unique.
Let me make another counter example then. If you think about the Israelites in the scripture, they are a nation without a state a lot of the time. And it is also the case that there are members of that tribe who are not ethnically Jewish. I think of Moses' wife. She was Abyssinian. And yet she was part of the tribe. And likewise today, I have friends in Israel who are ethnically not remotely Jewish, have no heritage. I have one friend who's part of the Orthodox community in Jerusalem, and she's entirely Anglo-Saxon ethnically, but she is absolutely Jewish, and she's part of the tribe. She did the whole conversion. So it doesn't seem to, I totally agree that there is an English ethnicity, but does it not, that it's also possible that there's an English heritage, and that we're talking about the metaphysical to some extent.
Yeah, well, the distinction there, of course, is that Judaism is also a religion, in just the same way that you can be a Catholic, whatever your caste or whatever your race is, and so Catholics tend to be the levels of racism in the Catholic Church were never anywhere near as close to what they were in other religions, for that very reason, that you had such a broad diaspora of people belonging to it. The way that I put it during the whole Rishi Sunak debate, I said the easiest way to explain what Rishi Sunak is to identify the difference between being English and being culturally English. And Rishi Sunak is culturally English. I'm culturally English too, but that's very different to being English. It's a question of semantics.
It's being ethnically English.
Yeah, well, I would say English, because I think
why wouldn't you preface the ethnic?
Because the English are a people who are they are the indigenous population of this country, and I think they are entitled to have that status. And and so that's why I think it's just the same as calling a woman a cis woman. I'm a woman. I don't need to have any qualifiers for that. This person is English. They're English. I'm culturally English. You won't find anybody who is more proud of England. And I did a speech recently on how England made the modern world. I can recite you 2 hours of English patriotic poetry and songs and so forth.
You're more English than all of my English friends.
Yeah, but that's my point. I'm culturally English, and I would die for this country. But I'm not ethnically English.
But no one would ever argue that. Or not necessarily. I mean, I don't fully know your
no, but my point is, so yes, there is a category of cultural English, but I don't want to hyphenate the indigenous populations being anything other than English.
Okay, so back to the unifying of the peoples who are now living in the territory of England, whatever they might identify as. You can be culturally English, and there's a clear heritage. I mentioned King Alfred, but we have a mythos. It's not just Alfred before him. There's the myths of Arthur, and we have various such stories that underpin and the story of the country. What is it for Britain? If Britishness is to be some version of a future Britishness is to be the unifying force, what would exactly be its founding mythos? And I guess that's a historical question. I don't.
Yeah, well, we already have its foundations. So history is the most important quality in rooting people to place. It provides people with a sense of identity and belonging, and hopefully pride and patriotism. One of the challenges we've had over the last 30 years, of course, is a deliberate attempt to subvert that history. We've had ideological subversion in our schools. Our history is being rewritten. Our heroes are being denigrated, their statues are being pulled down. We're told that Britain, of course, and the West and America are the root of all evil, that we're born into the new original sin of slavery, and that we're a systemically racist country. And that is the easiest way to demoralize and destabilize a society and get us to the position we're in right now, of course, where in 2008, 80% of the youth of this country were proud to be British. Today, it's 40%. It's halved in those 15-odd years.
So bleak.
So you need to have a robust promotion and defense of British history and British culture. Give people a reason to be proud. Don't pull down our statues. Erect statues to our great heroes. Celebrate the achievements of Churchill and Nelson, and what Britain achieved with as I said, Britain created the modern world. The first leap forward in 12,000 years of human history was the Industrial Revolution. Not since the Neolithic time had we seen an advance. Capitalism, that was invented by the Italian Renaissance states, and then later we had the Dutch doing their job in it as well. But it was the British who spread capitalism globally, and as I said, colonialism and capitalism lifted the whole world out of poverty. The English language, the English concepts of liberty have gone around the world. The parliamentary system and the American presidential system, the only two forms of government in the world, both came out of British origins. Those are the things we should be celebrating and being proud of. And once you actually provide people with the skeletal structure of the nation's achievement, they can then hang on their own achievements onto that. And that's how you build strong, productive societies. It's by being self-confident.
Yes.
It's by being assertive and somewhat aggressive, actually. Now, Russia and China understand that.
Yes.
They're, you may dislike them, and I dislike them greatly, but they know who they are, and they put forward a robust patriotic version of their history. Now, I don't want to have a jingoistic history. I don't want to have a biased history. I want a balanced history, but I don't want us to be ashamed of having essentially, I think no country in 1,000 years has had a bigger or better impact on the world.
Yes. Well, I agree with you. We've got much to be proud about. We are the ones, after all, who, after defeating Napoleon, we defeated slavery, and then we defeated Hitler. It's harder to think of a greater history to be a part of. But you mentioned balance. I wondered if you could strongman the case against the British colonialism and our force in the world. And I say that because part of the rhetoric around immigration, as we've been discussing, is that it's payback, it's revenge.
The empire strikes back.
The empire
That's how I like
strikes
to discuss immigration. Yes.
Yes, quite. So would you strongman their position?
Well, it's very easy to strongman it, and most of our kids are being taught the strongman argument every day at schools, right? It's all you hear about on television and the news. But of course, no country has the right to go over and conquer another people's, to suppress their culture, to supplant their rulers, to impose foreign religion on over their traditional native religions and cultures. No country has the right to enslave those peoples, to practice a two-tier society with white people on the top and others. I mean, it's pretty obvious what the downsides to imperialism are. But the argument I make in counter to all of that in terms of the modern day, I say it's very much similar to the argument about slavery reparations, for example. If I were alive in 1807 or 1833 when we abolished the slave trade and then abolished slavery, I would be absolutely in favor of reparations. If I were around in the 1820s or whatever, I have no idea what I would think, but I may be opposed to imperialism at the time. But if you look at the lives of the descendants of slaves today in Africa and the Caribbean and Britain and Canada, if you look today at the former British colonies around the world, no one can deny that they haven't benefited greatly. Mm-hmm. So the descendants of slaves, the American black population is the richest black diaspora, then the Canadian blacks are the next wealthiest, and then the British. The life expectancy of the descendants of slaves in the Caribbean is 15 years longer than it is in West Africa, where they came from. Their GDP per capita is 10 times higher than in West Africa. So no one can tell me in what ways their lives have been damaged by slavery and why they're entitled to reparations, because in terms of lifespan, money, everything else, they're enjoying a far higher quality of life than people in West Africa enjoy today. And similarly, for all the bad side of the British Empire, wherever you go in the world, the countries that are the most stable, most democratic, most prosperous are usually invariably former British colonies. And you look at Singapore, look at Israel, look at Canada, you look at the Caribbean states, look at Australia, New Zealand, even within Africa, the most successful countries within Africa are also former British colonies. And so, yes, you can be upset about what happened in the past, but I think you need to look at things in the round. And when people talk about decolonizing those countries, I say, fine, if you want to decolonize them, you get rid of the hospitals, get rid of the schools, get rid of the universities, get rid of the police structures, get rid of the army, get rid of the civil service, get rid of your government, get rid of the common law, get rid of the English language. Those are all the inheritances that they were bequeathed by the British. And what is the important point to remember here is to, for example, compare the British Empire to, say, the Soviet Empire. What happened in 1989, 1990 when Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria escaped from communism? They rushed to join Europe and NATO, and they immediately threw off all of their communist institutions and symbols, and they restored their old parliaments, their old flag, their old coats of arms, and so forth. What happened when the British Empire disintegrated? The countries immediately came back together in the form of the Commonwealth. You don't do that to an abuser, do you? They agreed to have the Queen either as head of their country or as head of the Commonwealth. But crucially, they didn't overthrow the institutions that the British had put there.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't want to overthrow what they had inherited. They simply wanted to run them themselves.
Yeah.
So Jinnah in Pakistan, the first leader of Pakistan, Nehru in India, they kept what they had inherited and they just put their own people in power.
Yeah.
And I think because they understood and they appreciated the benefits that it had brought. You know, in India, the population of India increased from 150 to 400 odd million during the era of the British Raj, because we had stopped the cyclical famines in those countries. We had increased, through the railways, we were able to ensure that people got food supplies whenever they needed it. Medicine, we stopped many diseases that were there. Also advanced women's rights in those countries. The reason you see so many prominent women in politics in Asia and Africa is because of the British Empire. These women were a suppressed community who had no rights. We banned sutti, the burning of Hindu widows on the funeral pyres. So there's headhunting in New Zealand. FGM and you know, banned human sacrifice in Africa, try to suppress it, stamp it out, put an end to the slave trade. So the bad side of the empire is obvious, but I think looking at it from today's perspective, the benefits certainly outweigh the bad.
Forgive me if you might tell me I'm absolutely not getting this, but what I'm sort of hearing might be that it shouldn't have happened in the first place, but had it having happened, if you look back, there are so many benefits that the benefits outweigh the horrors that happened.
Yeah,
I think that's a fair strong man of your...
The second half of the British Empire was essentially atoning for the sins of the first half. So no one can say that the British Empire started out with noble purposes. Drake was a privateer. You had the East India Company, who were rapacious in India, but they were removed in 1858, and then they were completely abolished in the 1870s. And if you look, for example, at Lord Curzon, who was a viceroy of India, very intelligent man, he adored India, and he said our motivation mustn't be profit; it must be it must be looking after the Indian people. And if you look at the second half of the British Empire, the people, the missionaries who went there, the doctors who went there, but also the great Orientalists who went there to discover Indian culture and civilization. So, you know, people may not realize that it was Englishmen, British people, who actually preserved Indian monuments and temples, because the Indians weren't looking after themselves. Same thing in Africa. The connection that no one knew that Buddha was Indian. Everybody, that wasn't known. It was the British who actually linked Buddha to India, who connected Sanskrit to Greek and Latin. So there were British and French scholars going through Asia, Egypt, and Africa, who were rediscovering the glorious cultures of these places, because the native populations had no interest or no knowledge. Were preserving the buildings, the documents, the artifacts of these countries, were educating the natives about their own culture and history and why they should be proud in it all, and were actually exporting knowledge about these ancient civilizations to the rest of the world. No one talks about that side of things, let alone, of course, as I say, stamping out abhorrent cultural practices. You know, and Steven Pinker, the Harvard professor, he said, you know, the lives of people in pre-colonial times and pre-modern state times were incalculably more harsh and more brutal than afterwards. And I think the problem is with Professor Stormzy and others is that there's this idea that there were people walking around in some sort of pre-colonial Valhalla, that everything was wonderful, that they were living to the age of 75, 80 with no wounds on them, they weren't getting attacked and beheaded by other rival tribes. I mean, the reality of what was going on in pre-colonial times is very unpleasant, and yet for some reason people think it was all smoke, you know, milk and roses.
I'd like to explore the decolonization from within, and you mentioned taking part of the institutions, the slow erosion. One part, I mean, there's a lot of philosophical aspect to that and ideology to it, but there was a turning away from the Commonwealth and towards Europe that happens in the second half of the 20th century, which seems to me to be quite pivotal. And I wondered if you could colour that in for me. That change in philosophy away from the Commonwealth, or why is it even today, for example, we don't learn about the Commonwealth like we used to, and we perhaps don't know about it as much as we used to. It's not emphasized in our culture as much. So I'm curious about that change. There must have been a point where the whole country had a decent understanding or pride in it, but now we're at least half the country are far more Euro focused.
Yeah, and I think it's a great shame. Britain's great legacy, of course, one of Britain's great legacies is the Commonwealth, but is also what I call the Kansuk nations: Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK. There's lots of talk about actually trying to have some form of association between those four countries, who are all very similar in their economies and their culture. And you've had the Australian leader of the Liberal Party and the Canadian. Both Mark Carney and his predecessor both advocating for some closer union, not necessarily a European union, but sort of even free movement of students and so forth. And what happened after the Second World War is quite simply the fact that, firstly, Britain was broke and wasn't able to sustain. And so, despite the interest of Churchill and others who wanted to see Britain essentially as not being part of Europe, being interested in Europe, but not being associated with it, we looked to the America and the Anglosphere. We looked at the English-speaking peoples, as Churchill said. That was a rival to the European Union. But because of our dependence upon America financially, it was felt we needed to have a closer association with Europe, which is fine. But to deny the natural connections between Canadians and Australians, New Zealanders and South Africans and the Brits, I think, is to deny the reality of the closeness, because the English Channel is far wider than the Atlantic when it comes to the connections and the bonds. We're kith and kin. Everyone has relations in Canada, Australia, or New Zealand. They love coming to the motherland, but we share the same monarch. I often say that we have the world's only trans monarch, because transnational, and this the same parliamentary. I mean, everything about our cultures is so similar. In Ottawa, you saw the Mounties, but you also had bare-skinned, Grenadier Guardsmen and so forth. The state opening of Parliament, and it's a great shame that this potential powerhouse of Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and the UK hasn't been taken advantage of more. We've got to begin the beginnings of it with this AUKUS, the defense pact in the Pacific region with America. But there's so much that unites us, and there's something called the Commonwealth advantage. There's a 21% lower cost of trade deals because of the common legal system, the common business practices, the shared language, and so forth. And Europe's history is one of warfare. The French and the Germans are never really going to get on as best friends. The Greeks despise the Germans. There's so much tension within Europe, whereas there's none of that. A friend of mine at the United Nations said to me, I'll always go and speak to the Canadians and Australians before I speak to my European friends, because there's just an understanding that we all get on together. Just why we have, the Five Eyes and so forth.
But I mean, on the person-to-person level, yes, but at the political level, the sort of, even in Britain, like, Trump is very hated by many Brits, and I think it's certainly true that at the cultural level, but at the political level, there's still an inclination towards Europe, I think. Do you think I'm wrong to think that?
No, at the political level, there's an understanding that the British Prime Minister gets on far better and far more easily and far more naturally with his Canadian and Australian and Kiwi counterparts than with his European.
So Keir seems to be getting on quite well with Donald as well.
Yeah, but there's an understanding. But just because of the fact that we have the shared systems and the shared value system, there's always been a much closer relationship politically between. I mean, that's why you have the Five Eyes. There's a reason that it doesn't include Europeans in any of that. Mm-hmm. There's just a natural affinity between those countries, politically, culturally, on the personal level.
Yeah. Well, and so you mentioned the institutions, and there's a sort of the deliberate tack from the inside. What can you colour in about this that's been going on?
Well, I think people if you want to understand why the world's gone crazy and why everything seems to have been completely made topsy-turvy, you need to understand that Britain is a post-revolutionary society. The revolution has already happened. Revolutions don't require great mobs marching through the streets and smashing windows and military force. There's been a quiet revolution that's taken place over the course of decades. All of our institutions look the same. The buildings are still standing there, but the people who occupy them, the people who run them, are cuckoos in the nest. These people they bear no comparison to the generations who built those institutions and ran them until very recently. And it's the civil service, it's government, it's the media class, it's the academic institutions, it's the cultural institutions. the HR departments of the businesses. Everything has changed fundamentally. We've been ideologically subverted, and we are still. It's been a top-down revolution. So this has been enforced upon us by the elite class. So the majority of the public disagree with all of this, but all of the levers of power have been taken over and captured. And you can trace all of this back to the Russian Revolution. What happened in 1917 was, of course, communists expected the first communist revolutions to take place in the industrialized West.
Mm-hmm.
The bourgeoisie versus the proletariat, seize the means of industrial production. Where did the revolution happen? In agrarian, the serf states of China and of Russia. And they couldn't understand that. And they realized, actually, that the people in Britain and Germany were actually small c patriots. They may be working class, but they loved their country. And so you have people like Antonio Gramsci, the Italian communist, who said, we need to actually understand that the elite class control the means of cultural and intellectual production as well as industrial production. They set the atmosphere. They are in control of creating the culture that dictates the fact that these people are small c conservatives. We need to change. We need to get control of the means of cultural intellectual production and change the mindset of the population fundamentally. At the same time, you had the Frankfurt School, you may have heard of in Germany, and the Frankfurt School with people like Herbert Marcuse and Horkheimer and others. They set about setting this into action by essentially saying we need to infiltrate the institutions of the media, of academia, of the cultural institutions, and try to essentially change the way that people view the world. Then at the end of the Second World War, they went to America. And they went to Berkeley, and they went to the American institutions. And that's where they basically began to have their ideas taken up by the next generation of the elites who were going to run the countries. And that didn't mean just getting into the cultural institutions and the media and so forth. It also meant the HR departments in corporations and elsewhere. And then, so in 1968, you had, of course, the period of unrest in America. Of course, you remember you had all the riots and so forth. And the new left, as they were called, the radical left in America, a lot of them wanted to have violent revolution overnight. They wanted bombings and terrorist attacks. And a chap called Rudi Deutschke said, look, chaps, America is not ready for this. America is passionately, deeply patriotic. They're going to reject any attempt at a far left thing. We need to have a long march through the institutions. We have to almost imperceptibly move the Overton window so people will end up parroting Marxist views without realizing it. And if you look at the early 1970s and you look at the pamphlets put out by these far left organizations, they were talking about things like systemic racism, white privilege, critical race theory. All of these concepts were there in the 1970s in little pamphlets printed for groups of maybe 100 people. And they were so far beyond the pale, of course, that everybody would have laughed at these concepts. And now look where we are.
Now they're mainstream.
These underground ideas have been mainstreamed and then being spouted by people who would never identify as Marxist, who probably reject Marxism. These are well-meaning liberals, the Be Kind Brigade. But that window has moved so much that they are actually promoting and perpetuating far-left Marxist concepts and ideas, thinking that this is just mainstream views and mainstream beliefs. And it's seeped into all aspects. And as I say, through HR departments, it's gone into the military, it's gone into corporations, where, corporations, as Milton Friedman said, the only interest of a corporation is the profits for the shareholder. Now suddenly they're making themselves deliberately poorer through the promotion of DI policies, and it's the first time corporations are making themselves poorer to pursue an untested theory.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why they ended up being so successful, and more successful here than in America, although quite successful there with this ideology, is because of what happened after the war. After the Second World War, of course, the horrors of the Holocaust, it was never again, and that. Of course, we want never again. And it seems that in that period, and we had a guy called R.R. Reno, or Rusty Reno, on the show, and his thesis is that basically it's Karl Popper. A lot of the problems come from him, and he created this dichotomy of what's good and what's bad. And in the good bucket, he puts liberalism, democracy, freedom. And in the bad bucket, he doesn't just put fascism and Nazism, which of course we would agree were bad and should be in that bucket, but he also puts nationalism in there. He puts religion in there, and Reno even argues truth in there. And so we seem to have learned a lot of the wrong lessons from the Second World War. Do you think there's anything in that theory?
Yeah, it's been the advance of liberalism at the expense of everything else, and anything which is so religion is deemed to be illiberal. It runs counter to the Enlightenment. Now, a big defender of the Enlightenment, but there was, you see, architecture is the easiest way to sort of illustrate it. There was this desire after the Second World War to completely abandon traditional forms of architecture and go into this postmodernism. And you saw
why is that?
And it's because they wanted to escape the past. I mean, if you saw the first beginnings of it after the First World War, that's when you really sort of you got the first movements of Bauhaus and everything else. And there was the shame associated with the legacies of the past. And as you said, everything in that bucket was put in there. So it wasn't just militarism, it was nationalism. Yeah. But then it was shame for your European identity that had unleashed this on the world. So yeah, there's a lot of truth there.
So the architecture represented what?
Architecture, a complete break with the past. So the modern architecture that came after the First World War and then the brutalism after the Second World War, this was a complete rejection of tradition, of heritage, of the evolution of the traditions of Christianity through church architecture, everything. Or the Gothic went
after the First World War. It's because of how horrific that was. There was a kind of trauma that people were reacting against. Whatever happened before led to the First World War or the Great War. And so we've got to do something different.
Yeah, and you can see it. People talk about the permissive society in the 60s, but of course the first permissive society was in the 1920s. And it was a complete,
What does permissive society mean?
Oh, permissive society, well, where anything goes. So permissive society had free love in the 60s and people could basically live untraditional, unconventional lives. But of course it was in the 1920s that, of course, you got the flappers, the girls with the Charleston, and that's when you had the Bloomsbury group were a bit earlier, but it was essentially a complete, almost sort of like an exasperation or a sort of an orgasmic release after the tension of the First World War. You had the first burgeonings of the modern pop youth culture that came out of that, sort of living for the moment, because you don't know when you're going to die, and just people becoming rather decadent and you could say debauched with their antics. But I would say that you say that it hasn't really affected America that much. I call woke American Marxism.
Sorry, it did. I was wrong to say that. I do think it did. It just happened, I think, later.
But I think we need to understand, even though the origins are at the Frankfurt School, it was the Frankfurt School in America that spread these ideas. And I think woke is too comfy of a term. It's too sweet of a term. I think, American Marxism is the best way to understand it. And, many people call woke a mind virus, which I think is correct, but it's a mind virus spread through the English language. That's why the most woke parts of the world are the Anglosphere, are the wokest of all. But then what comes next? It's Scandinavia, Denmark, and Holland. And why is that? Because they speak English almost as fluently as their native language. And as you look at where English is spoken most to least, that's where you see the spread of woke in comparison.
Although that also correlates with Protestantism. So it could be that there's a link there. And I think that there might be a little bit, because Protestantism is prone to faddism in a way that Catholicism isn't.
Well, except for the fact, of course, that in France and other places you're getting woke ideology seeping in there. But there is a connection with Protestantism primarily through Protestantism's critical role in creating the notion of the individual. So individualism is a Protestant creation. The most individualistic nations in the world are America, Canada, Britain, and then it's the Scandinavian countries, which are also Protestant.
You think it's a Protestant creation rather than a Christian creation?
Oh, absolutely. Because what happened, that's a very long story about how the West became unique. So the evolution of the West, the secret of the success of the West boils down. This is a theory of Joseph Heinrich, who wrote this very good book called The Weirdest People in the World. And weird means Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and developed. And the original weird countries were Western Europe, but now it applies to Japan as well. But he traces the uniqueness of the Western mind. And the Occidental mind is actually different in many ways to the Oriental mind. So even the way we perceive the world is different. So visual reasoning, spatial awareness, even facial recognition is different for Western minds than for non-Western minds. So, and the non-weird mind, for example, is much better at facial recognition because it uses equally the left and right hemispheres of the brain, whereas in weird cultures, we've co-opted the left hemisphere for language tasks. But if
Wow.
you, so we have a very fundamentally different way of viewing the world, and so Western success is because of the uniqueness of our perception of the world, and he traces it back to the Catholic Church, or the Western Church, because it was before the schism, enforcing a ban on cousin marriage, so marriage within certain degrees of consanguinity, and because of that, prior to that point, you had traditionally all around the world clans based on kinship. So your core social group, the group you engaged with, was simply your cousinships. So you could be, and whether you were first, second, third, fourth, fifth cousin, you were all essentially treated like brothers and sisters. There was no real distinction. And to this day, the majority of the world doesn't have the concept of the nuclear family that we have. And 75% of the world still has cousin marriages. By stopping cousin marriage, suddenly you had the rise of the nuclear family in Europe, which was unique to Western Europe. And that meant you had to rely on strangers for the first time. And so to get things done and to have trust in your fellow man and fellow strangers. And one of the key differences between the Western mind, between weird societies and the rest of the world, is our degree of faith in outgroups. So in groups are you and your family, outgroups are strangers. How much do you trust your fellow man? How much do you trust the people living around you? Do you believe that they're going to help you when you need help? Will they turn off the water supply if there's a drought, for example? And in Western cultures, we're far more trusting of strangers. And so because Westerners had to rely on strangers because of their having just a nuclear family, you began to get different groups arising. So you got confraternities, you got guilds, the first early trade unions, you had universities developing, you had charter towns developing. Charter towns are towns that you apply to join, and in exchange for that you promise to help develop those towns. And once you had these confraternities and guilds and everything else, you began to get cross-pollination of ideas. People began to riff off each other, and then you got innovation. And innovation is the driving force of the economy, and the driving force of the success of the West has been innovation and the cross-pollination of ideas, and that requires high degrees of social trust. And that's why you suddenly saw, following that, this rapid rise in the advancement of the West because of all of this. Then, because of Protestantism, you suddenly had a situation where you removed the priest as the intermediary between you and God. And so now suddenly Protestants had to learn to read, because Bibles were published in the vernacular language, and they needed to become literate. And their relationship with God was one of personal responsibility.
Right, I see. Okay.
And that's how you got the development of individualism. And as I said, the most successful countries in the world are the Protestant nations: America, Canada, Scandinavia, Britain,
I think you could still...
Australia. But then what happened, of course, is individualism can take on a life of its own. And so individualism was the greatest source of the prosperity of the world. But it's actually got to the point now. And just one other point on individualism is that you can test this. So if you, for example, if I were to ask you to identify yourself, you'll say, well, I'm Winston Marshall. I've got the world's best podcast.
I've got the world's best podcast guests.
Once in a while I dabble in music. You can say that's how you identify yourself. Now you go to the Congo and ask someone to identify themselves. They'll say, I'm so-and-so. I'm the son of X. I'm the husband of Y. I'm the father of Z. So it's still to this day in Western cultures, individualism is how you identify yourself. It's still clan-based in other countries.
I see. I see that. I think that the problem on this came really when you unmoored the individual from the metaphysic. So individualism, or I would say even liberalism, without Christianity, those separated. Even though liberalism originally came out in opposition to Christianity, they did kind of come together through the Victorian period. You tear them apart, then you lose basically the whole realm of the responsibility. You have individualism, which is all rights and freedom, but no responsibility. And that's where I think the problems came.
I agree. The problems came there, but we can't deny also that it was the connection of Protestantism to individualism and personal responsibility that saw the greatest development through, the Presbyterians and others. Of course, that Protestant work ethic of Max Weber, there's a lot of truth to that.
I like that analysis. I would perhaps go further, though, that the individual is really a Christian thing, and you can go further because of the individual relationship one has with God. Preceded, I think, the scriptural aspect, what Protestantism brought it. So, and you can see that with the concept of the soul evolving to the concept of the self. So I think it precedes it, right? The individual. Maybe that had to happen before
Yeah, but I think, well, anyway, I still think it's related to this. Well, I won't go through it all again.
Yes,
What I just
sure, sure,
explained.
sure. Yeah,
But
yeah.
also, but if you look, for example, so the Anglican Church was still fundamentally Catholic in its structure. This Church of England, it was King Henry's church after all, and it was still very hierarchical, with bishops essentially being princes of the church. But then if you look at the later, look at everything from the Methodists to the Quakers and so forth, these notions of individualism became far more pronounced and important, the less hierarchical and the less Catholic that these church structures became.
Yes, yes. I mentioned right at the beginning of the conversation the Chagos Islands, and I think this ties a lot of this conversation, but also of your work together, because this is decolonization in action, and explicitly so. And Keir Starmer won't say it, but Philip Sands, his friend, is explicitly a decolonizer, and explains how emotional he is or was representing Chagosians in the international courts, despite being British and legally British at least. And he's so in a sense, he represents the lawfare arm of the ideological wave that you've described in this conversation. I would love to know your take on Chagos Islands and how you see the deal and what your opinion is of it.
Well, it's a classic example of what I'm talking about when I talk about the long march through the institutions and being a post-revolutionary society, because the classic example is we now have a government that puts its own far-left post-colonial ideology ahead of Britain's national interest. I mean, this is a remarkable situation to be in. The British, David Lammy seems to think being foreign secretary means you advance foreign interests, not that you advance British interests. And but the greater irony, of course, is that what the Labour government have done is they've actually created a new form of 21st century imperialism, because Mauritius has no claim to the Chagos Islands of history. The Chagos Islands are 1,000 miles away.
I think it's about 2,000.
2,000 miles away from Mauritius. That's like Britain having claim to something in North Africa. The only reason that historically there was a connection was because the Chagos Islands were part of the same administration sector as Mauritius. But the Mauritian peoples never had any ownership of the Chagos Islands. There was no connection other than the fact that the French administered Chagos from Mauritius and then the British administered Chagos from Mauritius. That's the only connection. The Chagosians who live on Mauritius are second-class citizens who report all sorts of discrimination.
I note on that we have paid reparations. The British have paid reparations several times to the Chagosians via the Mauritian government, and the Chagosians have complained that they didn't get all the money.
So the money went to Mauritius and hasn't been given to the Chagosians. The Chagosians were never consulted on this, right? And the fundamental principle from the First World War and the League of Nations is the self-determination of peoples. And the Chagosian people have not been consulted. They've been handed around in precisely the same sort of way in the 19th century countries would carve up the world. That's precisely what's happening here. And for someone like Sands and Starmer and this repulsive Attorney General we now have in Hermo, who seems to be a far-left ideologue as much as anybody else, even more so.
His CV is astonishing.
And he, of course, was supporting all the reparations as well for the African and for the Caribbean nations. I mean, these are ideologues who have these fundamental instinct is essentially to undermine Britain by pursuing the ambitions of our enemies. And what's going to happen, of course, is it's going to embolden the reparation claimists from the Caribbean and embolden other countries. In Argentina, they've already said, we never thought we would actually ever be able to get the Falklands back. We certainly would never have considered under the Tories. They said, now it looks like we have allies and friends in the Labour government. So this is what
they say that.
Yeah.
What Malay's government said that.
Malay's government has said that we now have allies and friends with Labour, so we can advance the case for the Malvinas in a way that we never thought we could do under that. And of course, because they can see you have a weak country here, a weak government that's willing to actually yield, and not only that, but of course give access now to China in the region. We're trying to have AUKUS and a strong presence there. Yes. Mauritius is signed up to the non-nuclear treaty, so of course that could imperil our nuclear bases there. China's going to invariably be spying on what we have there. It is such a illogical and such a self-harming decision that it's obviously only done for purely ideological purposes.
It's worth, when talking about Chagos, to talk about what we did wrong. and I don't just referring to what Starmer's currently doing wrong, but in 1965 there were about 1,500 Chagosians who were forcibly moved, and I actually spoke to them. They happened to be just outside, and a couple of weeks ago, and they're explaining what they wanted, which was to it remain British and that they go back. So that seemed, but what's happened is they've done a few things all at once. It's give it to Mauritius, so there's kind of a decolonize, and there's a reparations thing. They're conflating justice for the individuals with this territorial claim. So it's a big muddle and very anti-British. And I'd be very concerned if we lost the Falklands. I guess with Falklands, the majority want to remain British, right?
Yeah, I mean, Starmer was a bit indifferent to the Falklands when first questioned about it, which raised questions. And then so he came out very forcefully, I think having been advised to do so, and said, I think his brother or some relation of his fought in the Falklands. And so he said, for me, it's personal. And I think that's his way of dampening things down, because I think people could see the opportunities that would be taken advantage of by Argentina over this episode.
Right. Rafe, it's been a great pleasure speaking with you. I definitely learned a hell of a lot. And where can listeners and viewers find you and follow your work?
Well, I'm on X at RAFHM, or you can just Google me on YouTube, and you can join and subscribe my YouTube channel where I post all sorts of crazy debates with crazy people.
They are, I can attest, they are absolutely crazy. We'll put links in the description for anyone who's watching and wants to click over there. But thank you so much for speaking with me. Are there any loose ends you think that need to be tied before we wrap things up?
No, I thought that was thoroughly enjoyable and a rip-roaring trip through a lot of subjects in a short period. So that was very good.
The pleasure was mine. Rafe, thank you so much. Thank you for watching the Winston Marshall Show with Rafe Heydel-Mankoo. Remember, if you want to support the show, all you have to do is press subscribe. And if you head over to winstonmarshall.co.uk, you'll get exclusive videos, interviews, content, and ad-free viewing. But until next time, be well.